Thank you for the warm welcome. So, first of all, the title of this talk is How the Church Created Science. It's a bit provocative, and I'll admit it's really clickbait. So let me say a word about what I mean by this and what I don't mean by this. First, I am not saying that the Catholic Church alone created science. My claim here is more modest. I simply want to discuss ways in which Christianity in general, and the Catholic Church in particular, were integral factors in the development of modern science as it actually took place in history. To do so, I will draw upon a number of scholarly sources, a growing number of which support this conclusion. While making the case that Christianity was not the sole factor in the rise of modern science, Noah Ephron nevertheless admits that the claim that Christianity led to modern science captures something true and important. Generations of historians and sociologists have discovered many ways in which Christianity, Christian beliefs, and Christian institutions played crucial roles in fashioning the tenets, methods, and institutions of what in time became modern science. Along these lines, I will cover three main aspects of how the Church aided the development of science. First, I will consider how the Church's beliefs fostered a conceptual environment conducive to scientific investigation. Second, I will present ways that the Church as an institution encouraged and supported scientific endeavors. And finally, I will discuss how individual Catholics have dedicated themselves to the advance of science, often leading to groundbreaking discoveries. The main goal of this presentation is to combat the popular myth that Christianity and the Catholic Church were and are enemies of science. Nothing could be further from the truth. The conflict myth about religion and science is largely the result of false narratives created for polemical purposes. In opposition to this false narrative, the Oxford Professor of Science and Religion, Peter Harrison, writes, "For much of the time, religion has facilitated scientific endeavor. Religious ideas inform and underpin scientific investigation. Those pursuing science were often motivated by religious impulses. Religious institutions frequently turn out to have been the chief sources of support for the scientific enterprise, and in its infancy, science established itself by appealing to religious values." Similarly, Rodney Stark says, "I argue not only that there is no inherent conflict between religion and science, but that Christian theology was essential for the rise of science." This leads us to our first section of the talk, the Church's conceptual contribution to the advent of science. Increasingly, historians of science are recognizing that modern science developed in an environment that made it intellectually possible. Science involves certain conceptual or philosophical presuppositions that have not always and everywhere been present and affirmed. The fact that science developed when and where it did is not arbitrary. It was the result of converging factors. One of these factors was a worldview informed by Judeo-Christian beliefs. There have been numerous advanced civilizations throughout history. Yet, as Nancy Percy and Charles Thaxton note, the type of thinking known today as scientific with its emphasis upon experiment and mathematical formulation, arose in one culture, Western Europe, and in no other. As Lauren Isley remarks, it is the Christian world which finally gave birth in a clear, articulate fashion to the experimental method of science itself. This gives rise to the question, why did science develop then and there specifically? What is it about a Christian worldview that is conducive to a scientific mentality? Here, I would like to discuss 5 particular aspects of Catholic Christian thought that helped foster the emergence of scientific thinking. 1, the world is orderly, which is a belief that not all religions and philosophies share. 2, the world is good, but not itself divine. 3, the Christian view of humanity's place within creation. 4, the recognition of limits to human rationality, especially in a fallen state. And 5, the Church's openness to insights coming from other cultures and natural philosophy. First, let's talk about the belief that the world is orderly. Scientific rationality presupposes certain things about the natural world, including the notion that the world is orderly. The doctrine of divine creation imbued Western culture with the view that nature comes from the divine mind. The universe is intelligible because it comes from divine creative intelligence. Without such a rational structure with regular patterns and processes, no hope could be had for studying the natural world. As Noah Ephron remarks, the very notion that nature is lawful was borrowed from Christian theology. As Rodney Stark likewise affirms, Christianity depicted God as a rational, responsive, dependable, and omnipotent being, and the universe as his personal creation, thus having a rational, lawful, stable structure awaiting human comprehension. It may seem obvious to contemporary people that nature is intelligible and follows specific laws that are describable through mathematical equations. But if one takes a step back, one can see that not every culture would necessarily have this view. In fact, not every culture or religion accepted that the natural world was even real. Some religions have held that the material world is an illusion. If that is a predominant thought pattern, then a society built upon it would hardly see investigating the world as a positive activity. Why would one want to spend time and effort analyzing an illusion? That would be akin to feeding a delusion. Not only would it not be praiseworthy, but it could be considered foolish at best and dangerous at worst. Now, even if a populace accepts the reality of the material world, that does not, in and of itself, automatically mean that it would see the natural world as worth studying. Some ancient civilizations viewed the world as inherently disordered. One cannot discern order where one expects nothing but chaos. In certain polytheistic or animistic religions, for example, what we call natural phenomena were solely the results of fluctuating divine passions. There was no sense in searching for a natural cause if the effects themselves were only produced by some deity's changing moods. If the natural world acts in a completely disordered and chaotic fashion, then it would be futile to try to unpack its inherent structure and modes of operation. Now we turn to the second belief that helps undergird a scientific approach to nature, the belief that the world is good, but not itself divine. This requires a balanced view of the natural material world. Some religions and philosophies saw the material world as evil, while others saw the world as itself divine. Both extremes can act as impediments to conducting scientific investigation. If the material world is inherently bad, then perhaps it would not be good to investigate it too closely. Some religions and philosophies viewed materiality as such to be evil. The world was something to escape, not delight in. According to the Judeo-Christian perspective, however, not only is the material world real, not only is it orderly, it is in fact good. Thus, write Piercy and Thaxton, against the surrounding Greek culture, the early church defended a high view of the material world. To the other extreme, certain religions and philosophies held that nature or the various parts of nature were themselves divine. Such pantheistic or animistic perspectives could actually hinder science for the opposite reason as those that saw the world as evil. If nature is God or a collection of gods, then subjecting natural phenomenon to experiments and manipulation could be viewed as impious and thus morally reprobate. As the historian of science, Gregor Mendel, contends, the de-deification of nature was a crucial precondition for science. As Hoykas writes, in total contradiction to pagan religion, nature is not a deity to be feared and worshipped, but a work of God to be admired, studied, and managed. The world is good, the creation of a good God, but it is not God, and therefore it can be studied without the fear of impiety. Again, the Judeo-Christian perspective provides a sort of balance needed for scientific investigation to be considered worthwhile. Related to this is our third point, the Christian view about the place of humanity within creation. Since humanity was created in the image and likeness of God, humans are elevated above the rest of creation. This view is augmented by Genesis 1:28, where God gives humans dominion over the earth. The earth and all that is in it, then, can and should be used by humans as a resource that they can work with for suitable ends. Now, that doesn't mean humans should exploit or destroy their natural environment, but it does mean that they can and should cultivate it, helping it to bear more fruit and to use it to benefit mankind. So argue Piercy and Thaxton in their book, The Soul of Science, Christian Faith and Natural Philosophy. On to our fourth point. The doctrine of original sin leads to the recognition that there are limits to natural human reason, especially in the fallen state. Because human reason is prone to misperception and errors, one has to be very deliberate and intentional in one's methods of observation in order to come to proper conclusions. Initial intuitions do not suffice. One must test one's hypotheses to see if they are correct. Noah Ephron thinks that this view supported the development of the scientific experimental approach to the studying of the world. He writes, quote, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Augustine's notion of original sin was embraced by advocates of experimental natural philosophy. As they saw it, fallen humans lacked the grace to understand the workings of the world through cogitation alone, requiring painstaking experiment and observation to arrive at knowledge of how nature works. In this way, Christian doctrine lent urgency to experiment. Another factor in the church's ability to help foster the development of science is her openness to sources coming from other cultures, including input coming from philosophical reflection and other modes of natural reason. Since her founding, the church has viewed rationality as an asset. In particular, the early church engaged with, and in some cases adopted, insights coming from classical Greek thought. This openness to truth wherever it is found is a hallmark of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Reason and faith are understood as being compatible and mutually illuminating. Now to our second section, the church's institutional support for science. Historically, the church as an institution has positively encouraged the sciences. It has done so in at least two ways. One, it literally set up institutions of higher learning that cultivated scholarship in a variety of academic disciplines. And two, as an institution, it supported the development of science through explicit encouragement and funding. First, we'll discuss the church's role in fostering education, including education in the sciences. It is the church's recognition of the value of philosophy and natural science that helped preserve the intellectual life in the face of the downfall of the Western Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. When Roman schools began disappearing, Christianity was expanding. As David Lindbergh notes, it was in fact a Christian institution, the monastery, that contributed the most to the preservation and the eventual spread of the classical sciences. The church's influence on education went well beyond the patristic era. In his book, The Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages, Edward Grant opposes the narrative that the Middle Ages were dark ages. To the contrary, he contends that the foundations of early modern science were laid in the Middle Ages. In fact, he goes so far as to say, quote, "A scientific revolution could not have occurred in Western Europe in the 17th century if the level of science and natural philosophy had remained what it was in the first half of the 12th century," end quote. In other words, the development of studies in the Middle Ages led to the scientific revolution. The scholar of scientific history, James Hannam, agrees. In his book, The Genesis of Science, How the Christian Middle Ages Launched the Scientific Revolution, Hannam remarks, "Much of the science and technology that we now take for granted has medieval origins." The church was at the forefront of providing attitudes and institutions that provided the impetus for science to develop. Grant himself offers three preconditions supplied in the Middle Ages that made the scientific revolution possible. One, the translation of Greco-Arabic works on science and natural philosophy into Latin. Two, the formation of the medieval university. And three, the emergence of the theologian natural philosophers. We will focus our attention on these latter two preconditions here. First, the development of the university system was crucial to the emergence of modern science. There are two components to the university system that were beneficial in this regard. One, the corporate structure of the universities, and two, the curricula that they employed. And the church had a role in both. As Michael Schenck notes, the medieval period gave birth to the university, which developed with active support of the papacy. As Stark similarly affirms, the rise of science was already far along by the 16th century, having been carefully nurtured by devout scholastics and that most Christian invention, the university. Keep in mind that during this time period in Western Europe, Christian is essentially equivalent to Catholic, since the Reformation had not yet taken place. As Stark points out, science was well along before there were any Protestants, and Catholics continued to play a vital role in the scientific blossoming of the 16th and 17th centuries. The university system is a huge part of the Catholic scientific legacy. The universities began largely as cathedral schools. The corporate structure of the universities afforded them significant rights and privileges that were unheard of at the time. As Grant notes, the universities received special treatment from church and secular authorities who sought to encourage their growth. Each faculty was given jurisdiction over its own internal affairs and therefore had the right to judge the worthiness of teachers and students who joined it as corporate members. There were also privileges relevant to personal status. Members of the universitas were accorded certain crucial rights, the most important of which was clerical status. Although most masters and students were neither ordained nor in orders, clerical status conferred upon them the rights of clergy. To attack a student or master who was traveling was the same as attacking a priest and was subject to severe penalties. Additionally, Rodney Stark points out that clerical status afforded university students and faculty the right to be tried only in an ecclesiastical court, where punishments were usually far milder than in civil courts. Thus, both the church and the state held the universities in high esteem. According to Nathan Schachner, the university was the darling, the spoiled child of the papacy and empire, of king and municipality alike. Privileges were showered on the proud universities in a continuous golden stream. Privileges that had no counterpart then, before, or since. Not even the sacred hierarchies of the church had quite the exemptions of the poorest begging scholar who could claim protection of a university. Popes intervened with menacing language to compel royalty to respect the inviolability of this favored institution. As we can see, the church was directly involved in the development of the universities, which concretely was a key element in the creation of modern science. In addition to the import of the corporate structure of the universities, the organization of curricula was also crucial to the development of academia, including science. Generally speaking, a bachelor's degree took about 3 to 4 years of study. A Master of Arts degree required an additional 1 to 2 years. But it's important to note that generally speaking, the Master of Arts degree was required before one could pursue a degree within one of the higher disciplines, such as law, medicine, or even theology. This point is important because the Master of Arts curriculum included key elements in the study of science. And this curriculum was directly supported by the church. As Michael Schenck remarks, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, if the medieval church had intended to discourage or suppress science, it certainly made a colossal mistake in tolerating, to say nothing of supporting, the university. In this new institution, Greco-Arabic science and medicine for the first time found a permanent home, one that science has retained to this day. Dozens of universities introduced large numbers of students to Euclidean geometry, optics, the problems of generation and reproduction, the rudiments of astronomy, and arguments for the sphericity of the earth. This was a cultural phenomenon of the first order, for it affected a literate elite of several 100,000 students. The cultural impact of this curriculum cannot be overstated, and the church was intimately involved in this phenomenon. The arts curriculum was originally centered on the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium was comprised of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The quadrivium included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. In time, the works of Aristotle and other Greco-Arabic scholars were also introduced. In particular, studies in moral philosophy or ethics and metaphysics became very important. Especially, a precursor to modern science, natural philosophy, also took center stage. In fact, for theologians, logic and natural philosophy, including physics, were considered indispensable. This leads us to another of Grant's preconditions for the development of science, the class of theologians who are also natural philosophers. As he says, a precondition for the scientific revolution was the emergence of a class of theologian natural philosophers. That is, a class of individuals who were not only trained in theology, but who also had previously attained the degree of Master of Arts or its equivalent, and were therefore thoroughly trained in that discipline. Their importance cannot be overestimated. If theologians at the universities had decided to oppose Aristotelian learning as dangerous to the faith, it could not have become the focus of study in European universities. Not only did they endorse a secular arts curriculum, but most believed that the natural philosophy was essential for a proper elucidation of theology. They were significant contributors to both natural philosophy and science, and most of them lectured or wrote on these subjects. Indeed, some of the most noteworthy accomplishments in science and mathematics during the Middle Ages came from theologians. Without going into all the specifics, Grant argues that this ecclesial support of the study of natural philosophy and science did not have a precise analog in other societies at the time. While there were Islamic scientists, for example, and during a certain time period, their scientists were actually better than the Christian scientists, they still did not have the same level of support from their religious leaders as the scientists did in Catholic Christian Europe. Thus, Grant argues, the three preconditions just discussed, the translations, the universities, and the theologian natural philosophers, laid a foundation for the emergence of modern science because they provided an environment that was conducive to the study of science. And without the support of the theologians and the church, the medieval universities would have been unable to institute the science, logic, natural philosophy curriculum that began Western Europe's long, uninterrupted involvement with scientific thought and problems. Through these considerations, it is evident then that the Church of the Middle Ages, through the development of universities and the central role of mathematics and natural sciences within their curricula, provided a foundation for the development of modern science. The Church also provided substantial monetary support to scientific advancement. In the words of John Heilbronn, the Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries than any other and probably all other institutions. Michael Schenck adds that Heilbronn's point can be generalized far beyond astronomy. The Church and her high-ranking officials were primary patrons of budding scientists, promoting and financially supporting the work of advancing scientific knowledge. The Church has perennially viewed science as a noble and worthy endeavor and has promoted scientific study. The Church supported scientific education both institutionally and through financial backing. Our third and final section, Catholic scientists. Human history occurs in and through the words and actions of concrete persons. Through the work of her members, the Church has contributed greatly to scientific advancement. Many important scientists were devoutly religious. In fact, contrary to some polemics, as Stark notes, professional scientists have remained about as religious as most everyone else, and far more religious than their academic colleagues in the arts and the social sciences. In this third and final section of my presentation, I would like to highlight a very small selection of a much larger group of Catholics who have been pioneers of science. For those of you who are interested in finding out more, I suggest you check out the website of the Society of Catholic Scientists. They have a great collection of biographies, and I'll largely draw from some of their resources here. Additionally, I think the members of the Society of Catholic Scientists themselves are great examples of the contributions of Catholics to modern science. We are blessed to have a number of those members speaking at this very conference. In this section, I will proceed chronologically. First, let's talk about St. Albert the Great. Although he lived well before what is popularly called the scientific revolution, St. Albert the Great deserves mention. This renowned teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas helped to introduce works of Greek and Arabic science into the curricula of medieval universities. He even advocated an experimental approach to science, a key element of modern science as we know it today. St. Albert the Great conducted his own observational studies in botany and zoology, contributing to the field of botanical taxonomy. He did original work on animal reproduction and in the study of insects. As the Society of Catholic Scientists notes, he was the first to distinguish between thorns and prickles on the basis of their formation and structure, to note the influence of light and heat on the growth of trees, and to discover that ants lose their sense of direction when their antennae are removed. These may seem like small achievements, but they already anticipate major aspects of modern science way back in the 13th century. One of the most recognizable names in the history of science is Nicholas Copernicus, who died in 1543. Copernicus is most well known as an astronomer who worked on the idea of heliocentrism, but he also studied medicine and canon law. Copernicus was himself a canon at the Catholic Cathedral of Frambourg. It is important to note that his heliocentric theory caught the positive attention of Pope Clement VII and several cardinals who attended a series of lectures he gave on the theory in 1533. Multiple cardinals encouraged Copernicus to publish his book outlining his arguments for heliocentrism, and Copernicus himself dedicated that book to Pope Paul III. The reason his theory did not take a foothold was primarily because other astronomers were not convinced by his arguments. The stellar parallax to prove the theory wasn't detected until 1838, long after the time of Copernicus and of Galileo, which is why heliocentrism was resisted for so long. Next, there is Pierre Gassendi, who died in 1655 and who played a significant role in the scientific revolution. His support for empiricism and his advocacy for the idea that matter is composed of atoms were pivotal components of scientific history. He made one of the earliest measurements of the speed of sound, determining that it was independent of the sound's pitch. Most significant for our current discussion is the fact that Gassendi was not only a scientist, he was a Catholic priest. One of our presenters at this conference, Lawrence Principe, has written a chapter in the book Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion, in which he presents numerous Catholics who contributed to the scientific revolution. One of these is Nicholas Steno, also known as Niels Stenson, who died in 1686. Principe notes that Stenson remains known today for his foundational work on fossils and the geological formation of rock strata, and that he converted to Catholicism during his scientific work and became first a priest, then a bishop, and is currently a beatus, that is, a blessed. Many of you have probably heard of the Cassini space probe. It is named after Giovanni Domenico Cassini, who died in 1712. Born in Tuscany, Cassini studied under Jesuit scientists Riccioli and Grimaldi. He was an observational astronomer who made numerous groundbreaking discoveries, including 4 of Saturn's moons, the gap in Saturn's rings appropriately called the Cassini division, and Jupiter's great red spot. Perhaps his greatest achievement was developing an ingenious method that enabled him to measure the size of the solar system. But that's not all. Cassini was a Catholic with special devotion to our Blessed Mother. He wrote a manuscript about the Immaculate Conception and recommended that it be celebrated as a special feast. Keep in mind, the Immaculate Conception was not dogmatically defined until 1854, 142 years after Cassini's death. Laura Bassi, who lived from 1711 to 1778, was an Italian physicist and the first woman to hold the rank of professor at a university, the University of Bologna. She promoted interest in Newtonian physics throughout Italy. Her work is also a special example of how the church supported science. Cardinal Lambertini, who eventually became Pope Benedict XIV, was one of her patrons. He encouraged her scientific studies and helped to promote her career. Pope Benedict XIV founded a group of 25 elite scholars with Laura Bassi as one of its members. How many of you knew that volts and amps are both named after devout Catholics? Volts are the standard unit of measurement of electrical potential. The term derives from the name of Alessandro Volta, an Italian scientist who died in 1827. He was the inventor of the very first battery. He also was the first to discover and isolate methane gas. Of particular note is Volta's own testimony to his Catholic faith. He wrote, quote, "Through the special mercy of God, I have never, as far as I know, wavered in my faith. I constantly give thanks to God, who has infused into me this belief in which I desire to live and die, with the firm hope of eternal life. In this faith, I recognize a pure gift of God, a supernatural grace. But I have not neglected those human means which confirm belief." Now, even if you don't know the difference between volts and amps, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the term amps, which comes from the name of André-Marie Ampere, who lived from 1775 to 1836. He was a major figure in the development of the theory of electromagnetism. He conducted a series of experiments that led to the discovery of Ampere's law, which describes the magnetic force between two pieces of wire carrying electric current. Like Alessandro Volta, Ampere was a sincerely devout Catholic. He was even the mentor of the founder of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, Blessed Frédéric Ozanam. On the occasion of Ampere's wife's early death, he wrote the following prayer: "O Lord, God of mercy, unite me in heaven with those whom you have permitted me to love on earth." He was also known to seek solace in reading the Bible and the works of the church fathers. An historian who was a contemporary of Ampere notes that Ampere saw an alliance of faith and science, of belief and hope in human thought and adoration before the revealed word. Ampere himself wrote, "We can see only the works of the Creator, but through them we rise to a knowledge of the Creator himself." Those of you who took high school biology probably remember the name Gregor Mendel. He was an Augustinian monk and is widely considered the founding father of genetics. He famously conducted experiments on peat plants in his monastery gardens. He carefully studied several inheritable traits across generations of the pea plants. He used mathematics to detect patterns in these traits, leading to Mendel's laws of inheritance. He died in 1884. Georges Lemaitre was the main proponent of the Big Bang theory, which remains at the core of modern cosmology. Prior to this theory, most scientists held that the universe was eternal, without beginning, and that it was static, neither expanding nor contracting. The term Big Bang was actually coined pejoratively by Fred Hoyle, who suspected that Lemaitre's Catholic beliefs were behind his theory, since it pointed towards the beginning of the cosmos. Lemaitre and his work have direct connections to Albert Einstein. In 1922, Lemaitre found solutions to Einstein's field equations, which pointed towards an expanding universe. To develop his Big Bang theory, Lemaitre combined his mathematical solution with the observations of the astronomer Slipher, which indicated that galaxies were moving far apart from one another at astonishing speeds. Einstein himself was extremely impressed with Lemaitre's work as a scientist and personally nominated him for the Franke Prize, which Lemaitre won in 1934. Lemaitre was also a devout Belgian Catholic priest. I would like to conclude this third section of my presentation by talking about the 1936 Nobel Prize winner in physics, Victor Hess, who lived from 1883 to 1964. Hess's chief scientific contribution was his discovery of cosmic rays, which gave rise to the field of astroparticle physics. Hess was also a devout Catholic. In fact, 10 years after winning the Nobel Prize, he wrote an article in the American Weekly entitled, "My Faith." The full article is available on the website of the Society of Catholic Scientists. I'd like to just read a few excerpts that are particularly noteworthy. To start, he answers yes to the question of whether a good scientist can believe in God. He writes, "In the first place, a scientist, more than other scholars, spends his time observing nature. It is his task to help unravel the mysteries of nature. He comes to marvel at these mysteries. Hence, it is not hard for a scientist to admire the greatness of the creator of nature. From this, it is only a step to adore God." Later on, he writes, "I must confess that in all my years of research in physics and geophysics, I have never found one instance in which scientific discovery was in conflict with religious faith." Elsewhere, he writes, "Must a scientist doubt the reality of miracles? As a scientist, I answer emphatically no. I can see no reason at all why Almighty God, who created us and all things around us, should not suspend or change, if he finds it wise to do so, the natural average course of events." And he concludes his entire article with these words, "What is certain is that when faith comes, there follows a great serenity of soul and a deep peace in the human heart." What a beautiful testimony to the depths of faith that even the most accomplished scientists can possess. In this presentation, we have discussed various ways that the Catholic Church aided the development of science. The Church's beliefs about the world as created intelligible by God helped provide an environment in which rational investigation into the natural world could be conducted. Through her promotion of education, most especially through her establishment of the university system and the corresponding curricula, the Church helped create that crucial institution of higher education that still serves as the foundation of scientific study and research today. Additionally, the Catholic hierarchy, including popes, encouraged scientists in their work and provided significant financial support for their efforts. Finally, we have merely touched upon the tip of the iceberg of the long list of Catholic scientists who made extremely vital contributions to scientific advancement. Given all of these considerations, it is clear that the Catholic Church was an integral part of the emergence of modern science. And many accomplished Catholic scholars, some of whom are with us at this very conference, continue the long legacy of Catholic contributions to the study of science. We owe a great deal of gratitude to these great heroes of the past and present, as well as to the Church herself, for their efforts to unlock the mysteries of this great universe created by our Lord and God. Ad majorem Dei gloriam, to the greater glory of God.